Alrighty, we are live. Welcome everyone to another Properties and Beers. So, let me ask you a question. What would happen tomorrow if your property portfolio or your tenant stopped paying rent tomorrow, right? Not for a week, not for a month. What if it went on for a whole damn year? Well, most property investors never really think about that. They just assume the rent's going to keep showing up every single week like clockwork. But the reality is sometimes it doesn't, right? And that's when it stops. You suddenly realize that it's something very uncomfortable about traditional property investing, right? You realize something uncomfortable about traditional property investing. Hey everyone, welcome back to Properties and Beers. And tonight's a slightly special one because I'm coming to you from Bali. I'm wearing my tropical gear, right? So the background looks a bit different. There's a bit of noise in the background. That's why. The tropical weather, a cold drink, and good property conversation. And by the way, we haven't met before. My name is Gaurav Gupta, CEO and founder of Ethical Property Investments. Our whole focus is helping everyday Aussies, people like just you and me, invest in high cash flow residential properties that are good for communities and strong for investors at the same time. And look, in simple terms, that means do good and make money. Right? So tonight, I want to talk to you about something most investors overlook. Because when people talk about property risk, they talk about interest rates or guarantees and all that sort of stuff, right? But the real risk most investors face is actually the income risk. And that's where the conversation really starts, my friends, right? Because before we get into the risk sides of property investing, there's something important I should acknowledge. There's a reason why property investing has been such a strong and powerful wealth building tool in Australia for decades. And part of that comes down to the tax system, which I want to cover today as well. One of the most significant advantages investors benefit from is called the capital gains tax discount. And understanding how that works might help explain why so many Aussies choose property as a long-term investment. Now, before we talk about risk, let's start with that. Now, before I get started, let me tell you where I am, what I'm doing, and how I'm doing it, right? So, we've got today, what are we doing? We're doing Bintang Crystal because we're in Bali and Crystal's a little bit of a lighter. It feels like a Coronesh. I like to have my traditional Asian style in a glass of ice with a bit of lime. Fantastic. It is missing a bit of lime, so I'm going to squeeze some lime into it. Now, if you're wondering where I'm at my friend's, shop, a place called Aussie Hookah. That's right. This is an Australian shisha shop here. And over here, if you haven't been here, they have some of the widest selection of shisha flavors. It is absolutely delicious, especially the Azure side of things. So, Jano and the boys, if you're watching, please come and hang out. We're missing you guys, and thank you, Gabrielle and Jano, for putting up a great place. So, let me get another sip before I go into my epic little rant. So let me ask you something. Two people earn the exact same amount of money. One earns it from salary. The other earns it from selling an investment property. Do you think they get the tax the same way? Most people assume they do, but in Australia, they actually don't. One of the big reasons, and that's one of the big reasons property has been such a powerful wealth building vehicle for decades. This thing called a capital gains discount. It's often called a 50% CGT discount. And to give you an idea, Australia is one of the few companies that actually has capital gains. In fact, let's look up which countries have capital gains. Now, few countries have it. Let's talk about it. So most countries in around the world offer 0% capital gains tax for individuals. We're talking about Singapore. Hey, Singapore is one of the top countries in the world for investors to invest in, yet they charge 0% capital gains. That's Monaco, Belgium, Hong Kong. Are you reading between the lines here? The wealthiest countries and the countries that attract the wealthiest people are charging 0% capital gains discount. Switzerland, Cayman Islands, Belize, Bahamas, and other nations like Czech Republic, right? We're talking about, and these are the most livable countries in the world, right? And yeah, of course, we've got countries like Malta, Luxembourg, these places, even South Korea doesn't charge capital gains tax. And so the fact that we're getting charged tax on capital gains is an interesting thing. So for those new to investing, let me zoom out a little bit, right? Here's how it works. If you buy a property in Australia and you hold it for more than 12 months, the government allows you to pay tax on only half the profit when you sell. By the way, tax which may or may not be unfair. That's up to you, right? So the simple rule is that that one simple rule makes a big difference over time, and it allows it it convinces people to hold on to property for longer, which is currently part of the issue that we're facing. That people aren't stifling their properties over. People living in 5-6 bedroom houses that they had with their kids, McMansions, aren't downsizing um, because they've got that. There's really no benefit for them selling, right? And just a reminder: a lot of cases, not all cases, you're basically paying tax on already taxed incomes. Now, in the case of owner occupied, which is 0% capital gains tax, that's not really counted. But a lot of times, people are paying tax on tax on tax. So, like, we need to get rid of the double, triple, quadruple taxation system, right? Um, but the CGT discount is in a good place. It effectively cuts your taxable portion of your profit in half. Let's say you're in a 45% tax bracket and you've earned enough income. The income that you earn basically gets taxed at the full 45%. But if you've held a property, effectively the tax on that profit becomes close to 22.5%. So that's a substantial difference. And look, it goes a fair way into way of actually making the market a little bit easier to invest in. Unfortunately, though, there's issues with that, right? It can, but for most investors who have invested in property over the long term, it makes a significant difference to accelerate your wealth creation. And we should all hope that people become wealthier and wealthier. We shouldn't be talking about penalizing this person or penalizing that person because everyone's a greedy landlord. I'm sorry, but what is it, like 70 or 80% of investors own one investment property? These aren't greedy people. They're mums, dads, teachers, nurses. I know multiple teachers who have invested in property. They're not greedy landlords. They're human beings, right? Let's put a human being face on it, right? Now, here's the part many investors don't talk about when they first hear about CGT. Keeping more of your profit not only feels good, but it changes how fast your portfolio can grow. Because when you sell an asset and keep more of the profit after tax, you've got capital available to reinvest in more properties, right? Or more, whatever else you want to invest in, or donate to charity, whatever you want for you, right? Maybe that becomes a deposit for the next two properties, easing the housing burden that we have right now in Australia, right? Every time you reinvest the capital, the portfolio gets another opportunity to compound. And that process, we repeat over 10, 20, 30 years, the impact of a compounding becomes enormous. And compounding is, seventh wonder of the world, according to Albert Einstein. And so this is one of the reasons where long-term property investors end up building significant portfolios, right? Another interesting feature of the CGT is that it encourages long-term thinking. You're not talking house flipping. We're not doing house flipping like they do in America a lot, and that house flipping is not really a thing in Australia, which I'm kind of grateful for. The 12-month rules discourages short-term speculation and rewards people who like the buy and hold approach. Daniel, how's it going? Good to see you here. Look, most people tend to keep their properties as rental for many years, increasing the rental stock. The system's encouraging both long-term investing and long-term rental supply at the same time. So the tax framework is designed partially to reward stability in the market. Now, if it's really about increasing tax, hey, go tax the mining companies, the gas companies that Alba refuses to answer questions about when he does public interviews, right? Yes, you heard me right. Now, of course, not everyone agrees with these policies. People think investors are these big bad wolves who just have to take advantage of people. They're not, right? Some people argue advantages like the CGT discount at least give investors a padded landing and more purchasing power at the end of the day, right? They may be able to bid higher on properties if they want to, compared to first home buyers. And that's what some people argue. And there's political discussion around whether this is, it should be reduced from 50 to 25% or even zero, right? At the same time, many economists who, I kind of trust a little bit, point out that if these incentives disappear, investors are likely to be less active in the market. And pardon my French, but we bloody hell need more investors in the market. We have a housing crisis. Not enough houses are getting built. We need to build more houses. And look, if fewer investors provide fewer rental housing, that reduces the supply and push up rent, which is the opposite of what people want, right? That's not going to increase housing supply. You want to increase housing supply? Reduce the taxes on builds, which have gone up. And I've said this on every property news recently. Housing taxes on building houses have gone up over 100% in the last 7 years from both governments. I'm not pointing to one or the other governments. They've both gone up, right? So it's an ongoing conversation to Australia's housing policy. Now, before I go on my next epic rant, I need another sip of the Bintang Crystal. And I know some people that haven't been to Southeast Asia are saying, Goro, you're having beer with ice and lime? That's sacrilege. That's how they roll over here, right? When in Rome. Yeah, greedy landlords, right? Dan, I love hearing that term. Okay. Regardless of where the debate goes in the future, one thing's clear. Property has historically been a long-term, powerful long-term investment in no, property in Australia has been historically a powerfully long-term investment vehicle here in Australia. And because of that, millions of Australians have built wealth through property, taken care of their families, invested, donated money to charity and really taken care of themselves. Because the stock market here we have in Australia, the S&P, I'm not comparing the two. Please, I'm not comparing property in the stock market. I'm just saying the reason why I personally choose to invest in property over the stock market because the S&P in Australia is really lackluster in terms of performance compared to other markets like USA or India. India, I know I can put money into a fund. In India, I prefer investing in a fund over property because that gives me 18% yield. I'd rather do that, right? America, you get your 10, 12% yields, even 15% yields in the S&P when you invest it over a period of time. That doesn't exist as much in Australia. And I'm not a financial planner. I'm not pretending to be one now. That's my disclaimer. But that's why I personally choose to invest in property. Look, once you start investing, something interesting happens. Most investors spend a lot of time thinking about tax benefits, growth, capital gains. They overlook a completely different risk. And the risk is income risk, which brings us to something most investors don't fully think about when they buy their first property, right? And there's a hidden risk that a lot of people aren't aware of. So most investors assume that once they buy a property, rent's going to keep flowing in nice and steady. Every week, money comes in to support the mortgage, right? The bank account gets credited, and after a while, it feels automatic. The reality is, though, traditional rental property has one tenant and one income stream. And one, my friends, is a dangerous number, right? If the income stream drops, the income drops to zero. That's something that a lot of investors don't fully appreciate until they experience it themselves. To be honest, I've experienced this myself. Yeah, and those that turned on properties and beers last week, you probably remember the story. So let me share it here again because there was some tech issues on last week, properties and beers. So let's illustrate the point. In one case within our family portfolio, we had a tenant who didn't pay rent. I'm not talking 3, 4, 5, 6 months. I'm talking 18 months, right? 18 months. That's painful. And you need the system, and I'm not going to go into the system, there are others that are watching. Now, during that time, we still had to pay the mortgage. Interest rates allowed to be paid. Insurance had to be paid. Council rates allowed to be paid. Council did some. These people didn't like. These other parties didn't like. Oh, you're not receiving rent. Let's stop your rent. No, there's no. That's a risk an investor takes, right? The property didn't stop costing money just because the tenant had stopped paying rent. The financial obligations kept ticking along every single month. And what made it even more frustrating was the tenant knew the system. So right before certain legal deadlines, they pay their little tiny amount, just enough to delay the eviction process, right? And just to stretch things out longer. And if you dealt with tenancy law, VCAT, QCAT, whatever CAT system you deal with, these processes can take time. So drag on and on and on and on. And you know what? That's a reality sometimes. It doesn't happen to anyone, but when it does happen, it can hurt. Not just financially, but mentally as well. Because you're watching the property sit there while someone's living there while the expenses continue. You know what? If I want to donate to a charity, I'll go donate to a charity, right? Even if you don't run into a situation like that, most landlords still experience vacancy at some point in time because the tenants move, life changes, people relocate for jobs, families grow and need bigger homes. So eventually a tenant leaves, the property becomes empty. You might need to repaint, replace the carpets, and do some small repairs before you put it in the market. Hey, I've done that many times, right? Then you list the property again and wait for the next tenant. During that time, income stops, but the mortgage itself doesn't. Look, like me at that moment, the mortgage had to be paid. All of that sort of stuff happened. The clock kept ticking every single month. And many investors don't realize a traditional property, one person controls, say that again. In a traditional property, one person controls the entire income of the asset. One tenant, right? Dangerous number. If they leave, they stop paying or credit issues, the property produces nothing, zilch, zero, nada, right? It's essentially an on or off switch, income on or income off. Right? And that's not always obvious when you buy the first property because when things are going smoothly, you don't really think about it. The tenant's paying, the systems are working, everything looks really fine. But it only really becomes obvious when things go wrong, right? And that's when investors realize how dependent on the property they have is on one single tenant. Now, in my case, I was a little bit lucky. I was more fortunate. At that time, I'd invested in another property that had strong cash flow, and that probably helped absorb the loss. So we were able to ride through that situation. It wasn't pleasant, but we survived it. But many investors don't have that buffer. They're still trusting on one, right? They might own one or a couple of properties, and if all these properties stop producing income over a period of time, it can add real financial pressure. And that, my friends, is where the real risk sits. It isn't in the property itself, but the income structure behind it. So, what do we do about it? The question that I get asked is, Cora, can you give me a guarantee? Well, forget guarantees. If you watch my previous property interviews, you know I'm anti-guarantee. I want to talk about risk reduction and more about like what I said to one of my clients today, my word is my bond, right? But how do we reduce the risk? How do you stop one tenant from controlling the entire income of your property? Well, that's where a different property model starts becoming interesting. One of the models that we work with is co-living housing. And the reason why investors are finding that interesting is very simple. Instead of having one tenant pay your rent, you have multiple tenants leasing individual rooms. Imagine for a moment a 5-bedroom property, each paying one rental payment each week. So you get 5 separate rental payments, 5 different income sources, 5 different tenants contributing to the income of that very property. And straight away, something interesting happens. The income risk becomes spread out, right? So if one tenant leaves in traditional rental, it becomes completely vacant. Income goes to zero. But in a co-living property, if one room becomes vacant, then the other rooms are still occupied. Income continues. Sorry, I'm drinking beer and going on a rant. But in a co-living property, right? As I said, if one room becomes vacant, the other rooms are occupied. Income goes forward. You might lose a portion of the income temporarily until a new tenant moves in, but the property itself does not stop producing income. And that's the magic. It keeps working. You spread your risk around several tenants instead of relying on one. In fact, in one of my properties, I've got actually 13 residents. I know the Victorian rule is 12. We've actually got exemption on one of our properties to have 13 tenants in one property living in a very large, nice house, right? And from a portfolio perspective, that makes the income profile a lot more resilient. And resilience is key in the uncertain markets that we have. We've got so much crazy shit going on around the world, right? I'll use that word. So much crazy shit going on in the world. It's important to have resilience, especially with your own investing, right? Now, another beer before I go on my next round. The other thing I hear people say when it comes to co-living, it's like, must be chaotic to manage, right? People are like, Goro, co-living sounds like a pain in the damn ass. They picture 5, 10, whatever people living under the same house and assume it must be difficult for the landlord. Hey, I've lived in share houses before. I feel it, right? But the reality is, most of these properties are run by professional property managers who specialize in this type of housing. They've got systems in place. They understand how room agreements work. They understand tenant placement, what kind of person to have in the house and not in the house, who will match with each other. And they understand how to manage these shared spaces. So from the investor's perspective, the management process is already very structured. You're not personally going to manage the property. And if you are planning to, please don't do it. That's a recipe in disaster, right? You're not personally running the house or coordinating tenants. That's handled by the professionals who do this for work every single day. And that's their role. Do they charge more management fees? Yes, they do. Because they're managing multiple tenants under one roof. And yeah, there's a little bit of loading for that, right? And the other thing I hear a lot, Goro, isn't construction costs higher? They should co-living properties cost dramatically more than a regular build. You know what? Honestly, it's between 0 and 10 to 20% more to build one of these co-livings. And in fact, we usually get bank valuations, and depending on the lender you go with, it's pretty good, right? So when the design's done properly from the start, the construction costs can be very close to a traditional house. And yes, there are really important design considerations. You might configure the property differently, and the big difference is the income and the structure of the property. The same piece of land, the same suburb, but a very different way of generating income. And that's what we're talking about. The same mortgage, effectively, that you're holding. Your mortgage repayments are the same. I mean, imagine that world, right? So when you start looking at property this way, something really interesting happens. You care about the fundamentals investors talk about. You care about what suburb you're buying and the local demand, infrastructure, population growth. All of that still really matters. The fundamentals don't go away, and they are crucial. But when you start adding another question on top of that, you'll start now be asking, how's the property itself structured? Because you know what? Two properties sitting on the same street can perform very differently, but depending on how they're designed and how the income's set up. And once investors start thinking at that level, it changes a lot of how the conversation works. Now, I'm going to start changing the gear up into something Tony Robbins talks about, but I need to have a beer before I do that. So I'm going to pour the rest of my Bintang into here. Enjoy, guys. I'm going to talk about a concept I've learned from Tony Robbins, right? And that's the idea of raising your standards. Now, he's not just talking about your standards in business, but in life itself. And what he means by that is simple. The results we get in life are often a reflection on the standards we choose to accept. And property investing, many people settle for good enough. They buy a property, rent it out, hope the market grows, and hope and pray is not a strategy, guys. It's a headache. And that's the thing. When you raise your standards, you start thinking differently. I start asking questions. How do I reduce my risk in my portfolio while creating strong cash flow? How do I have my cake and eat it too? Right? How can I structure my property so it works better financially and socially? And no, smart investors don't ask about guarantees. Right? There's no such damn thing in this world called a guarantee. Most guarantees, almost all guarantees, aren't worth the paper they're written on. What's important is a promise. Right? I was speaking to a successful business owner earlier today. He's heavily invested in real estate, 6+ properties in Australia alone, plus his assets overseas. And he said to me, Goro, I don't want a guarantee. I want your word and your bond. Because you know what? That means more to me than a piece of paper by a random real estate agent. And I think that's really important to look at, right? Let's ask a high quality question. So one thing we care about deeply at Ethical Property Investors is to make sure the property also serves a purpose in the community, right? Because it's do good and then make money, not make money full stop, right? Co-living housing, for example, helps create affordable accommodation for people that genuinely need it. Young professional students, workers relocating for jobs. The properties, it's not an investment. It really helps solve the housing crisis. It helps solve the real housing need that we need here in Australia, right? And that's the core idea behind it. Properties that are structured in a way that supports communities while also delivering strong cash flow for investors. When these two things align, property becomes a very powerful vehicle, right? Now, I'm gonna wrap up in just a minute, but I wanted to introduce someone, but she's still on the phone, so we'll do that in other properties and views in Bali. Before I wrap up, I want to mention something really quickly. A large percentage of you watch Properties and Views haven't followed our page yet. Follow Ethical Property Investments. Might be missing some content that we share during the week. And by the way, on the 26th, I believe, I'm doing a co-living webinar. I'll put the link in the chat box below. If you've enjoyed tonight's conversation and want to learn more about co-living or SDA or anything like that, follow our page. Drop me a line in the chat. That way, and even if you've got something that you want me to discuss in next week's Properties and Views, put in the comments, right? If we share any of this discussion, investor insights, you'll have them in your feed and same loop. And of course, I'm going to be bringing more sessions like this to you, sometimes from Australia and of course from really cool spots like Bali, my second home. Thank you, ladies and gents, for joining me tonight for another Properties and Beers. Cheers, everyone, and have an outstanding weekend.